Welcome to The Good Ride, where we suck less through better gear. I'm James Beastie, and this is the Good Ride Alternative Freeride Favorites List. So what's an alternative freeride board? Well, this is a tapered, directional, pretty set back board in comparison to all mountain boards. Not as much as snow surf, but it comes in a shorter, wider package than a traditional freeride board. Now, why should you trust this list? Well, first and foremost, this is not a pay-to-play favorites list. All these boards earned their spot on their own merits. Secondly, this comes from an average rider's perspective who's ridden close to 800 snowboards and a lot more if you count the variations of models over the years. Lastly, I extensively test and compare these boards, and when I can, I get my friends on these and get their perspective as well. So first on the list is the Jones Hovercraft 2.0. The new board is a little more tapered, a little more directional, a little more set back on board than the old Hovercraft. It has that same camber that goes basically from the short nubby tail all the way past the front inserts, then transitions into rocker before the spoon nose. It's got a medium, bordering on medium stiff flex, but has a very damp personality that's great in all conditions. This board's pretty wide and I ride it a little shorter at a 156, but man, does this thing float. It floats better than the old Hovercraft. It sits a little more set back on board. It's not quite snow surf set back. You're not riding the tail, but you have more directional float than most of the boards on this list. To top it off, it also just rips groomers. It really likes a rider who likes to go straight and fast, but it's not gonna fall apart on you if you wanna make across the groomer carves, even a circle carve on occasion, or get a little slashy and turny in powder. It lets you do that. And I love the way the spoon nose turns in powder. It makes the turning experience so smooth and fluid. It has a very fast base and very competent grip in harder snow. Next is the K2 Excavator. This is tapered and directional with a pretty decent setback on board, but not all the way to the tail. It's got a mellow but long camber going from almost the tail to a little bit before the nose. You definitely ride this shorter and wider. I'm kind of in between sizes at a 150 and a 154, but it doesn't feel bucky and bouncy, and it's got a very deep turny side cut that really likes across the groomer to circle carves. Now this base does not match the price point and it almost kept this board off the list. But the way this carves and the way this pops on an ollie kept it here. It's a very versatile one board quiver for those who favor directional riding and like a more turny board, but still don't want a board that's gonna fall apart on them if they straight line. Next up is the Rome Stale Fish. It's got a good bit of taper. It's very directional. It has an almost surfy shape to it, but it has a very centered stance, and you definitely ride this a little shorter and wider than you normally would. For example, I'm in between the 154 and 157. If I wanted a perfect daily driver, I'd probably go 154, but if I was riding powder primarily, I'd go 157. It's got a good bit of camber going from almost the tail to a little before this long diamond nose that has a lot of lift on the sides, starting from a little before the effective edge and then gradually increasing into the nose. It gives you that spoon nose type of fluid, smooth turning experience in softer snow and powder. Doesn't feel washy in the tail either because there's little to no lift in the tail. This has a very turny, slashy, surfy feel to it, but yet it has a much more centered stance that isn't that set back on board. So you have a centered feel when you get air or you're riding steeper terrain, and it really lights up there. On groomers, this rails a turn, and in powder, it floats really easy and well, much better than I thought for being so centered on the board. Next up is a board I've enjoyed for many years, the Yes Hybrid. I ride this in a 153. It is tapered and directional, but with a little more of a centered stance than its more turny, set back counterpart, the Optimistic. It's got a moderate camber between the feet with a little less early rise in the tail, a little more early rise in the nose, but the early rise is mellow. I find myself recommending this a lot for people who see hard to icy snow because it accomplishes two things. One, it feels very stable underfoot in all conditions because of that hybrid camber without being catchy. And then it has this crazy disruption in the side cut they call tapered underbite that grips really well in hard to icy snow. I found myself recommending this more than two other honorable mentions that excel in hard snow, the Libtech Orca and the GNU Gremlin. It has the stability of the Gremlin without the catchiness and more float, and feels more stable than the Orca, and also has a faster base than both. You can still go Gremlin if you want more pop on an ollie and spring out of a turn, and Orca if you want a more loose, slashy ride. But I find the hybrid has this smooth, consistent personality in all conditions and never lets you down in any one condition. It can carve. It has a very balanced but grippy side cut that can accommodate any type of turn that you'd like to do. It rides a lot bigger for its size, doesn't feel bucky or bouncy, floats well in powder, and carves hard on groomers. Next up is the Salomon Dancehaul. This is moderately tapered, pretty directional, has a good setback on board. It has a camber profile that is mostly camber with a little bit of early rise before the tail and a touch more before the nose. Of all these boards, I felt the most comfortable throwing this around switch, and this has a little bit of that one board all mountain quiver who like to incorporate a little bit more of a mountain freestyle vibe into their free ride board. It pops super easy. It's fun to butter. It's fun to play around with, but you can lay out a pretty hard turn with this, and while it lives on the turny side, it can make all kinds of turns. The one drawback is it can get a little bucky and bouncy in uneven snow, but it doesn't get cranky at least, and it's manageable. When set all the way back, this floats pretty well in powder too, and I had a really fun time in all conditions with this. It also has a pretty fast base for this price point. Next up is the Nidecker Mellow. This is very directional and pretty set back on board, but doesn't have a lot of taper, only 6 mil, which is a lot less than most of the boards on this list. It has a mellow camber, mainly over the back foot, and then a lot of early rise before the nose. This is a board I often recommend for guys with bigger feet because with a lot of tapered directional free ride, alternative free ride, snow surf, powder boards, they all have less width over the back foot than they do the front foot. This one's almost equal. That's why they say this is a wide. That being said, I still have a lot of fun on my 150, and I wouldn't say it's just for wides only. It's just a little more challenging for people like me to turn when the conditions get a little more uneven and messy. Other than that, it's a great board. Davey loves this in a 155 and could rock a 160 wide as well. And I find myself recommending this to a lot of wider footed riders who want that short, wide, directional, floaty feel in all conditions. This can carve groomers very well for having such a mellow camber off the back foot. And while it doesn't have a lot of taper, all that early rise and setback on board compensates for that and gives this really solid float. It has a more turny side cut, but it can make all kinds of turns. Next up is the Korua Transition Finder. This is pretty tapered, pretty directional, pretty set back on board. This has a good amount of camber, almost from the tail to a little bit before the nose. There's still a little bit of early rise, and it doesn't feel like a full camber board in terms of catchiness. But this thing carves so hard. It's such a pleasure to turn. It's my favorite board on this list to turn and carve with. I'm happiest with this board in a 154, and you definitely ride this a little shorter than you would your average freeride board. It still doesn't feel bucky or bouncy or have a lot of chatter. It can get a touch cranky in hard, micro bumpy snow, but it's far from being a deal breaker, especially with the spring out of the turn that you get, the float you get in powder, and the ollie power you can get as well. This is set back, but not so far set back that you can't get a lot of air with this and have a lot of tail to land on. This definitely has a different feel underfoot than most of Korua's snow surf boards, and is kind of the bridge between the auto and the rest of their super tapered setback directional snow surfy rides. Next up is the Amplid Surfari. This is a pretty tapered, pretty directional setback board. It rides a little bigger and it kind of sits on that border between being freeride and alternative freeride, but it just to me felt a little more alternative freeride than it did freeride, so I'm putting it on the list here. This has a good bit of camber going from almost the tail to a little bit before the nose. Then they have some lifted sides that do not bleed at all into the effective edge, but still make for a fun turning experience in powder. Of all these boards, this drives really hard off your front foot and feels the most centered and non-tapered, even though it has a good bit of taper. If you drive off your front foot, this is going to be a board that's going to work for you really well. But even if you like to ride centered or back foot weight out of your turns, this is still gonna be very fun. This has a ton of pop, and usually with a ton of pop, you get a ton of chatter. This doesn't have that. This is one of the dampest boards on this list. You can straight up point it with this, but then you can make these fun turns and get this easy air. Rarely do you have a balance of pop and dampness like this. That's what makes this board so unique. It's more for those who like to go fast and straight. And in powder, it might not have the float of some of these boards, but it's still very competent there and won't let you down when it gets deep. And last but not least is the Gentemstick Mantaray. They make a 154 for everywhere and a 156 for the US only to fit a bigger size. This is pretty tapered and pretty directional. It's got a decent setback on board as well, but it's not a setback as a lot of the snow surfers from Gentemstick's line. It has a very mellow camber going to a decent amount of early rise before the nose. And this is just a special board. It's been around for a long time and it's inspired many other brands to make similar boards like this. Some of them you see on this list. And again, they're similar, they're not the same. It's got one of the fastest bases in the business. This glide is just exceptional, and I don't know why this turns this well for having so little camber, but I love it. It's not this hard, powerful, high-speed carver, but the way this board turns is just so satisfying. I think about it for days after I ride it. The float is really good in powder and there's a decent setback on board, but it's not as floaty as some of Gentemstick's super setback, more snow surfy line, but it's very competent. It's very expensive, but if you can swing it, it's a really fun board to have in your quiver. So there you have it. That's my list. There are lots of great alternative freeride short wide boards out there. So if your board didn't make the list, or you're not sure about any of these boards, go to the Good Ride Snowboard Reviews. Use our sorts, use our filters, use our comparison tool, and find the board that appeals to you the most.